Philosophy, Theology and Agriculture, the missing link. In 1763, the King of England invited Mason and Dixon to draw their famous line bisecting New England. This line notoriously respects no natural boundaries of topography or climate or soil. In itself, it represents something of the distinctively modern approach to land management. It was created using newly developed surveying techniques designed to settle a long-running proprietary dispute. The land for Mason and Dixon and the king they represented was not place, but space, a continuous homogeneous extension to be portioned and distributed according to the mathematical calculus of the new physical sciences. In fact, the first attempt to complete the line was frustrated by the Iroquois guides of the surveying party, who refused to enter territories belonging to a neighboring tribe. To the Iroquois, the land was not mere extension, but thickly textured and variegated with human meanings. The use of cartographical techniques as tools of colonial domination is well known. The particular case of the Mason-Dixon line is interesting for another reason, which is that the demographics thus divided practiced quite different sorts of agriculture. In the region bisected by the line, identical climate, topography, and soil became home to two completely different styles of farming. South of the line, in Maryland, were tobacco plantations farmed by the Catholic Calvert family. Enormously profitable, they were worked by indentured servants and slaves. If you crossed into the territories of the Quaker Penns, north of the line, the plantations suddenly stopped. There were only sprawling family farms, growing corn and wheat and keeping dairy herds. These Quakers could have made a lot more money starting tobacco plantations. Many of them large families taking refuge from desperate poverty in Wales. This would have been both tempting and legal. But the Quakers did not like the idea of slavery. They prized above all a harmonious religious and family life, expressed in the family farm unit. They sought to create agroeconomic structures and patterns that would nurture the virtues of community, virtues which seemed incompatible with the cultural and social values of the plantation environment. These two agricultures were divided not by what their material conditions made physically possible, but by the sort of world each community saw itself to be living in. It was culture, not material conditions, that determined what farming meant to these two communities, the crops they grew, the methods they used to work the soil, to irrigate, to harvest, to landscape their places, with all of the human habits of thought and feeling and social structure that such practices sustain and are sustained by. Climate and landscape necessarily limit the kinds of agriculture that can be practiced, but the same landscape, soil, and topography can be shaped to represent two quite different visions of human and cosmic good. Agricultures, in other words, are underdetermined by physical parameters. Making the earth fruitful for human needs is not just a given, pre-structured and determined activity. It expresses visions of value, which are metaphysical in structure, that is, which are founded on an understanding of what is ultimately real and good, and how human beings live in conformity with that. What we have in agricultural practice is thus internal and not external to considerations that we properly think of as theological or philosophical. We can ask of any particular agriculture, what metaphysics does it express? What worldview does it reproduce and embody? About these questions, however, there is a resounding silence in agriculture and agronomy and in philosophy and theology. This silence limits the conversation about our planetary future. For the question of agriculture crystallizes something more general about the debate on sustainability. This is simply that it makes no sense to talk about sustainability apart from a conversation about what it is we are trying to sustain. That is, the good. And it makes no sense to talk about how to relate to nature if we are not prepared to ask what nature is. That is, the true. In this lecture, I will not be advocating particular answers to these questions. We are not at the stage societally where we can have that debate because we do not see yet that it needs to be had. In our cultural and political environment, policy is largely conducted in procedural terms, and ethics is largely conducted in isolation from questions of metaphysics or epistemology. What needs defense in the current context, therefore, is the validity of the questions themselves and the necessity of asking them. This lecture is a brief intervention to that end. It is no wonder that contemporary philosophy and theology neglect agriculture. We live in the first society that could reasonably be called post-agricultural. The obviousness of agriculture as a primary context for human life is therefore lost to us. We no longer consciously connect eating with agriculture or with the earth itself. Separated by vast distances, conceptual and geographical, from the age-old drama of making the earth fruitful for human beings, agriculture is out of sight and out of mind. Our vegetables arrive in their plastic packets with no evidence on them that they ever came from the earth. For all we know, they could have been made in a factory. As for our bread, an ancient symbol of the unique confluence of the human and the earthly, which we declare in the Eucharistic liturgy to be, quote, fruit of the earth and work of human hands, it would be quite possible for a person to go their whole life and never know that it was made of wheat, which grew in the soil under the sun and the rain. Nevertheless, agriculture has finally gained a profile as a topic of debate among ethicists, even as those in agronomy and agriculture themselves rarely engage that debate. To remind you of a few uncontroversial facts, agriculture accounts for over a quarter of global greenhouse emissions. Over a quarter. Half of the world's habitable land is used for agriculture. 70% of global freshwater withdrawals are used for agriculture. 78% of global ocean and freshwater eutrophication is caused by agriculture. 94% of mammal biomass on planet Earth is livestock, domesticated animals. And of the 28,000 species evaluated to be threatened by extinction by the IUCN, the International Union for the Conservation of Nature, agriculture is listed as a threat to 24,000 of them. The testy relationship between agriculturalists and environmentalists, which results from these changes, has promoted a partial but steadily increasing awareness that we do need a conversation about values to guide our agricultural practices. Most critiques of contemporary agriculture assume that it can be subject to ethical evaluation and analysis using the same conceptual procedures and norms and styles of moral inquiry that would be used to assess any other area of the economy. This reflects the fact that agriculture since the Industrial Revolution has been subsumed into and construed in terms of industrial economy. Indeed, this reconceptualization of agriculture played a key role in the evolution of a distinctively modern understanding of economy and ownership. The development of new technologies for transport of agricultural goods was, as E.P. Thompson famously argued, a key social transition. People who were not neighbors, who didn't know one another and had no relationship other than an economic one, were now connected through monetary transactions. The modern ethical project was shaped by the need to produce generalized theories of social ethics that could apply equally across all economic activities, the interaction, in fact, of strangers. In this scheme, what divides the ethical theories of modernity is less fundamental than what unites them. For as far as agriculture is concerned, it is handled as though it was just another member of the general class of technological activity. But agriculture is not just another member of this class. It has, I want to suggest to you, a unique metaphysical weight because it encapsulates the peculiarly human way in which we are animals. This metaphysical dimension is rarely acknowledged, let alone critically engaged, in agronomy and agricultural ethics, nor is it engaged in philosophy and theology. That the human being is defined above all as a being who must eat, whose flesh is not self-sustaining but needs to be fed, is a tenet equally of Ludwig Feuerbach and the Book of Genesis, as Alexander Schmemann memorably points out in his classic For the Life of the World. But the meaning of agriculture is not reducible to our need to eat. This need is not distinctive of human beings. What is distinctively human about agriculture is expressed in Genesis as, quote, tilling and keeping. Agriculture represents not the fact that we need to eat, but how we choose to mediate that need. In agriculture, that need becomes a creative, constructive interaction between ourselves and the world that is not ourselves, or to use the terms of phenomenologist David Abram, more than ourselves. So agriculture expresses the distinctively human case of what Jewish philosopher Hans Jonas identifies as the existential situation of organic existence as such, what he calls needful freedom. Human agricultures are interpretations of our need to eat, and in this way they are interpretations of the specifically dependent and earthly quality of our bodiliness. Wendell Berry captures this truth when he declares that, quote, we live in agriculture as we live in flesh. Because for the human being to live in flesh is to live with a choice of how to interpret our living. In its intersection of freedom with necessity, mental and cultural with material and biological, agriculture is both expressive of humanness and creative of it. No wonder that the Hebrew Bible puts agriculture at the very heart of the human vocation as such. To farm is, Aristotle recognized, to act in between nature and culture. As the word suggests, it is a culture in itself, but a culture which operates within and continuously renegotiates the ambiguous limits and fixities of nature in a way which itself modifies nature over time. This is distinct from the technological modification of inert objects for human ends, as I might construct a table out of a tree, which is, by the time I cut it up, quite dead. Or as I might take elements from the ground in mining. In agriculture, the human process intersects, goes along with, cooperates with, channels and directs ongoing natural processes. It therefore has most intimately to do with physis in the original etymology of that term as phuo, to grow. It is a cooperative, creative harnessing of things which have their own internal dynamics of change and directedness, that is, they are alive. In agriculture, the matter of the world is not just a given, which we either take or leave, as we can take or leave oil under the Arctic sea ice, for example. To work soil so that it grows, let's say, wheat, requires a labor of synergy between the farmer and the soil and the plants, in which all are shaped and redefined. The bread which results is a product equally of nature and culture, as the Eucharistic liturgy acknowledges. It is this unique confluence that makes bread a peculiarly intense expression of humanity as such. It represents what it is to be human, dwelling in a world like this. In this synergy, that is agriculture, the boundary between human flesh and earth is both continually reaffirmed and reconstituted. We do not completely control nature, and we depend on nature as a force beyond and outside ourselves, and at the same time, this boundary is continually rendered porous and permeable. We shape nature, and the result of this shaping comes to constitute our bodiliness, for we are what we eat, and the cultures in which that bodiliness is interpreted, on which agricultural practices have a deeply formative force. So agriculture expresses, on the one hand, the human as a natural and a cultural being, and on the other, the earth as a constraining limit with its own structure and agency, which nevertheless represents an almost unknowably rich adaptability and receptivity. In agriculture, our flesh and the earth are simultaneously experienced, not as inert givens, but as dynamic gifts which call for active creative reception and interpretation. Agriculture then is not just another application of human technology. It places before us in a particularly acute way the questions of what it is to be human in this world and what sort of world this is. Considering agriculture in this light helps us to see what is distinctive and questionable about the metaphysics of modern industrial agriculture. We can cast this into further relief by counterposing it to a very different agriculture, that of Israel as depicted in the Hebrew Bible. Israel's scriptures open with an invitation to see this world as a certain sort of thing. It invites us to set our human life and its purposes on an infinitely wide canvas, a canvas we call creation. Walter Brueggemann famously described the first chapter of Genesis as a liturgical poem, the recitation of which inducts one into a story of this world as a reality constituted by the freely uttered divine word. Ellen Davis, whose groundbreaking agrarian commentary on the Hebrew Scriptures I rely on here, sees the poem as proposing a contemplative regard of the world, a regard which is able to perceive the inner principles in accordance with which things were created and are organized, and therefore to act in the world appropriately. As liturgical, the text is a performance of correct perception of these inner principles, which enables the people to participate actively in the order which is revealed. In other words, how we see the world's origins, structure, and destiny has a practical force. Metaphysics is a theoria, a truthful seeing of the world, which generates a distinctive ethic. As Wendell Berry puts it, to change one's mind is to change the way one works. In Genesis, agricultural activity enacts Israel's conformity to the divine vision of cosmic order. Tilling and keeping the earth are definitive of being human in God's world. We are to use and maintain the fruitfulness of the earth in fulfillment of the divine command and subject to the divine law. Presupposed by this understanding is the metaphysics of a single cosmic order, which is simultaneously moral and physical. The Levitical Code, for example, refuses compartmentalisation by moving easily across agricultural, cultic, dietary, and sexual observance with what is to us the bizarre assumption of continuity. This wholeness of creation is a signature of the Israelite worldview. Before God, the world exists as a bio-spiritual unity, which is internally and not extrinsically moral. This refusal of compartmentalisation reflects the way in which Israel's observance of the Torah is intimately wrapped up with its obedience to the divine command to till and keep the earth. In this command, God indicates what human participation in cosmic order looks like. Human beings do not observe the cosmic order from a distance. They are intrinsic to it. By enacting their humanness in conformity with that order, they maintain its balance and sustain it into the future. In the Liturgy of Israel, the human offering of the fruits of agricultural labour is expressive of the covenant, and that offering maintains the rhythm and harmony of the cosmos as a whole. The land in this vision is the embodied context which mediates the exchange of divine favour and human obedience. It is both the context and the content of the promise, and it is both agent and patient in the divine economy. In this order, the land's fruitfulness is not a given, but is indexed to human faithfulness. This faithfulness on the part of Israel sustains the land itself, and in turn, the land's ability to sustain human communities. This is perhaps an example of what Marshall Salins calls generalized reciprocity. There is a three-way gift exchange between God, human beings, and the earth itself. An earth which is itself construed as having expectations, which God justifies and warrants. The earth's native rhythms, needs, capacities, and limits do not constitute a bare physical environment. Israel has no category of the merely physical, but a single weave of creation, in which meaning and materiality do not come apart. The performance of tilling and keeping is intrinsic to the human vocation as such, but it is parsed in an entirely specific way for Israel. The invitation to Israel to be at home in the land of promise is framed in terms of God's particular attention to that place. God's seeing of it becomes a mandate and a command for Israel. God's eye is on this land in its uniqueness. It is a land unlike the territories around it. It requires particular forms of care from Israel, just as God cares for it in particular ways. The gift of the land is therefore bound up with the command to a certain kind of sustained attention on the part of Israel, an attention to what sort of land it is that it has been given, an attention which is mimetic of God's own attention to the land. Davis argues that the Genesis command to till and keep has the sense of to serve and to observe. In this vision, our service to the land is only possible by sensitization to what sort of land it is, what it quite literally needs from us. Not only is such an understanding of the agricultural task not merely functional, it is not simply ethical either. Agriculture for Israel is ethical because it is first metaphysical, in the sense of emerging from a theoria of the whole. It is based on seeing the world truly. This involves a discipline of loving attention, both to the whole cosmic order and to the particular land in which one's responsibility to till and keep is concretely exercised. Human failure to sustain this attention is a sort of blindness to the world as it is, which has dire consequences. Because of the unity of the world, such blindness results eventually in an undoing of creation itself. Modern industrial agriculture might seem, in contrast, to be determinedly anti-metaphysical. It reflects a cultural situation in which we do not see our activities as intersecting with cosmic order, certainly not at the policy and governance level. Contemporary agronomy is marked by the same proceduralism that characterizes modern ethics. It operates apparently without reference to any vision of the whole. It sees itself as engaged in purely empirical problem solving, in which the only relevant question is the technical one of how to get the maximum calories from the minimum land area with the minimum resources, what a leading voice in agricultural ethics calls productionism. In this sense, it might seem that contemporary agriculture is without metaphysics, that this is its distinguishing feature. But to let this stand would be to consent to what Charles Taylor identifies as a subtraction thesis. In fact, like secularism, such a vision of agriculture contains a positive metaphysic in its own right, what Taylor calls a closed world structure. It is not a moral vacuum. There is still an operative notion of the good, and indeed without such a horizon of the good there couldn't be any directed action at all, but this good possesses no explicit transcendent reference. It is immanently understood human good, the good of human health and growth. This end is conceived in abstraction from a cosmic good. It's taken as self-sufficient and self-explanatory. In this scheme, the scheme of modern industrial agriculture, nature is understood either as endlessly malleable, nature that is, has no nature, or it is understood as containing physical but not moral or spiritual qualities. A broadly Cartesian understanding of the relationship between physical and mental is operating here. Meaning and morality are intrahuman and intramental, and the external world is simply bare extension to be rearranged and manipulated with an infinite degree of plasticity. In this vision, moral, spiritual, and physical orders can be readily distinguished from one another, disentangled and dealt with quite separately. The meaning of a physical action, such as ploughing a field, is external to it. It is imputed to it, rather than inhering in the shape and character of the action itself, and the way that action shapes the whole agent into a particular kind of creature. Contemporary industrial agriculture is thus, metaphysically speaking, a naturalism. I am not here intending to contest modern industrial agriculture at the ethical level, though it desperately needs to be contested. I am trying to point out simply that it deserves attention at the level of world picture. It is not the case that it presupposes no cosmic order. It is simply that we don't talk about the cosmic order it presupposes. In not talking about it, we tacitly consent to it. Failing to see agriculture as metaphysical, We never engage explicitly with the question of whether this is the sort of world we want to live in or think we are living in. Many critiques of modern industrial agriculture assume the same governing end as that agriculture of an abstract, naturalized human good. The critique is constituted simply by the presentation of alternative data, which suggests that there might be better routes to achieving that end. In that case, the context in which the human good is understood and construed and interpreted remains unarticulated, and therefore not available for interrogation. This compromises the ethical debate. I'll mention 3 illustrations of this. Firstly, it is common among those endeavouring to mount critiques of industrial agriculture to describe it as an anthropocentrism, and to contrast it with ecocentric, and by implication pro-environmental, ethical thinking. Too much of the conversation between agriculturalists and environmentalists is hung up on this impasse. It is not the existence or priority of the human good that distinguishes contemporary agriculture from previous agricultures, but the implied context of that good, its abstractedness. The question is not whether human beings are at the centre. The inescapably basic presupposition of agricultural activity is the sheer absoluteness, the non-negotiability of our need to eat. The question is about the context of that need, the shape of the reality in which human life unfolds and seeks sustenance. The perception of that reality shapes the way we choose to meet that need, the way in which the distinctive modes of our meeting that need are more or less life-giving, more or less truthful interpretations of our humanity, interpretations of our being, to quote Alistair McIntyre, dependent, rational animals. Second, and relatedly, simply countering the assertion of human value with concepts of the intrinsic value of non-human entities doesn't really change anything. It is to operate with the same exclusively ethical conception of the problem. It presents one force with an equal and opposite counterforce, but on the same plane. What is needed is a restoration of something like a worldview level conversation, in which we acknowledge a thickly textured conception of the good that allows for the perception and adjudication of a diverse range of finite goods, operating at different levels and interacting not as competitors, but as a tapestry of created meaning. Thirdly, I'm not sure how helpful it is to frame the debate in terms of a contrast between productionist and agrarian understandings of agriculture. Agrarian models rightly see agriculture as a key social institution, whose specialization has left a vacuum of meaningful contact with nature and grounded communities at place. But much contemporary agrarianism is in the lineage of what Taylor calls romantic expressivism, a trend equally evident in the consumer ethics movements, which are closely allied to the new agrarianism. In this context, the issue is allowed to remain at the level of lifestyle choice, which expresses a personal authenticity. This is, as Taylor himself persuasively notes, a compelling narrative and not a bad one. And the ethical critique which the new agrarians and the consumer ethics movements mount is fundamentally correct. But in refusing to connect agriculture more than gesturally with the question of metaphysics, that is to say, with an ultimate framing, a cosmic whole, their prophetic power remains limited. They sit too comfortably within the marketized paradigm of global capitalism, even as they construe themselves as enacting resistance to it. In this paradigm, I can talk about personal goods I perceive and values I hold to. I can talk about health, immanently conceived, environmental or physical, but I can't easily talk about the intersection of agriculture with the meaning and shape and character of the whole, of reality itself, which, as I have argued, agriculture directly raises as a question. Agrarianism is sometimes identified as being distinguished by its recognizing agriculture as having an ethical dimension, in contrast to productionism. But if this is all agrarianism is, as a form of resistance to productionism, it is a weak move. To conclude, Israel's agricultural vision can have only limited traction on contemporary society. In using it as a foil for contemporary agriculture, as I have done here, I am not trying to make the point that the agriculture of the Hebrew Bible is to be preferred over that of Western secular modernity. As it happens, I think it to make such an argument too quickly risks a kind of nostalgic idealism, and there is more to be said for productionism than the agrarians acknowledge. No, my point is what the contrast itself brings to light. It invites us to see that agricultures implicitly narrate some notion of cosmic order and present basic options for being human within that order. The apparently practical question of how to farm is at some level secondary to the question of what it means for us to farm and to live by farming. How we could start a conversation at this level in government and policy and science and popular debate when our public sphere in liberal, democratic, pluralistic societies has such a low tolerance for worldview level conversations is another question. I have sought only to point to the need for such a conversation. Letting the debate about agriculture stay at the level of ethics is to miss the way in which farming is a worldview issue. It is about who we are, in what kind of world. But we can create the conditions for that conversation if we resist specialism. Agriculture is a potent solvent for the idea that we could postpone doing philosophy and theology, as though they are luxuries to be indulged only when we have settled the practical matters. The practical matters are philosophical and theological. And philosophy and theology should, as Wendell Berry urges, go out into the fields, at least conceptually, if not literally. It's time to join up what should never have been separated. Thank you.